South Park is famous for looking like it was built from scraps of paper, even after its production became a fast digital machine. The strange part is that the show keeps protecting that crude look until a joke needs something paper cannot do. In this video, we look at all the times South Park has changed its animation style, the handmade look that became a rule. South Park looks cheap because its earliest characters were pieces of paper moved by hand. That gave the town its stiff bodies and sudden movements. But a student short and a weekly television series demand different amounts of work. The handmade process was about to face its first serious test. Before South Park had a weekly schedule, Trey Parker and Matt Stone were students at the University of Colorado making short films with whatever methods they could control themselves. Their first version of The Spirit of Christmas grew out of that environment. The characters were simple because simple shapes could be cut quickly, separated into pieces, and moved without requiring a full traditional animation crew. Heads were circles, bodies were basic blocks, arms could be shifted without redrawing a shoulder, a face could change because a different mouth or pair of eyes was placed on top. The result looked less like polished television animation than something built on a classroom table, which was close to the truth. The second Spirit of Christmas short pushed those ideas further. The figures still looked handmade, and the movement still came from physical parts, but the film spread far beyond the room where it had been assembled. Copies circulated on videotape until people who had no connection to Parker or Stone were passing it around. The appeal did not depend on the animation being smooth. The roughness made the violence and language feel even more wrong coming from children who looked as though they had been cut from colored paper 5 minutes earlier. A professional finish might have made the same material feel more ordinary. The cheap appearance made it feel like something that should not have existed on television at all. That became important when Comedy Central wanted a series. A short could survive a slow handmade process because it only had to be completed once. Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, which originally aired on August 13, 1997 as Season 1, Episode 1, grew out of an original unaired pilot that had to sustain the same physical construction paper method across a full episode. Characters were built from construction paper. Their mouths, eyes, hands, clothing, and other pieces had to be arranged for the frame being photographed. Then something had to move, another picture had to be taken, and the process had to repeat. The method explains several traits that later became part of South Park's identity. Characters usually face forward because turning a paper body naturally is difficult. Their arms swing as separate shapes because they really were separate shapes. Facial expressions change in steps because a mouth can be swapped more easily than a face can be redrawn through a smooth transition. A head may suddenly tilt from one prepared position to another instead of traveling through every point between them. Even the small shadows around overlapping pieces came from the physical fact that one layer of paper sat above another. Nothing about that movement was neutral once audiences started recognizing it. Stan's blue hat and brown coat were only part of his identity. His body behaved like a paper doll. Cartman's round shape worked the same way. His head, mouth, arms, and torso shifted with the same stubborn stiffness as the material used to make him. Kenny's hood worked partly because so much information about a character could be reduced to a few shapes. South Park could make a person recognizable with less movement and less facial detail than most television cartoons needed. The pilot showed the cost of doing that literally. The handmade production stretched for months. A change that sounded tiny in a meeting could mean returning to physical materials, cutting another piece, rebuilding part of a shot, and photographing it again. The process had none of the easy undo buttons that would later become normal. If a mouth was wrong, the answer was another mouth. If a body needed to be somewhere else, somebody had to move it. If a scene changed after a large amount of work had already been photographed, the work did not become flexible simply because the joke had improved. That created a strange problem for a show built around fast comedy. Parker and Stone could rewrite dialogue quickly. They could decide that a joke was weak and replace it. Their characters, however, were trapped inside a production method where each visual change demanded physical labor. The freedom of the writing and the slowness of the animation were moving in opposite directions. A television order did not reduce that problem. It multiplied it, because finishing one episode only meant another had to begin. The obvious solution would have been to redesign the series for a faster conventional animation process. South Park could have kept the same 4 boys while smoothing their movement, simplifying the number of physical pieces, or sending the work through a pipeline that made the characters behave more like ordinary television cartoons. That would have solved the production problem by changing the thing audiences had already started noticing. Instead, the limitation itself became something that had to survive. The crude look was now attached to the comedy. A child whose mouth snapped between paper shapes could say something outrageous without losing the odd distance created by the design. A violent event could happen with almost no realistic motion. A person could explode into flat pieces. Then the town could continue as though a classroom craft project had been torn apart. The simplicity let the show move from childish to grotesque without needing the physical detail that might make the same scene feel much heavier. It also gave South Park an immediate silhouette. A viewer did not need to see a logo to recognize the town. The round heads, tiny legs, flat snow, simple houses, and layered clothing already announced where the scene belonged. That kind of recognition is difficult to create deliberately. South Park had stumbled into it through a method chosen when Parker and Stone were still doing most of the work with paper, cameras, and a small group of collaborators. The irony is that the original process became least practical at the moment its visual consequences became most valuable. Before the series, rough motion could be dismissed as the natural result of limited resources. After the pilot, the same rough motion was part of what Comedy Central had bought. The show needed to become more efficient without looking as though efficiency had touched it. That changed what an animation upgrade meant. For most productions, better tools promise smoother movement, cleaner drawings, more detail, and fewer visible mistakes. South Park needed better tools to hide the fact that better tools were being used. The goal was no longer to make the characters out of construction paper. The goal was to preserve the evidence that they once had been. The distinction matters because the series never truly returned to the original physical workflow. The famous paper look survived, but the paper itself stopped being the normal production material. What remained were rules learned from the material. Arms should still feel detachable. Heads should still move in blunt shifts. Faces should still be built from simple, replaceable pieces. Depth should exist only when the joke needs it. A background can become more detailed, but Stan should still look like Stan could be lifted off the screen and placed on a table. Some of the original pieces survived after the production moved away from them. Eric Stoltz, who had worked with Parker and Stone before South Park became a series and later became a major part of its animation team, has described old construction paper material being kept rather than discarded. Some pieces were framed or given away. Others remain stored together. Those objects are useful because they make the difference between the first South Park and every later version visible in the simplest possible way. The original character was an object. The modern character is data designed to remember the object. That memory includes imperfections nobody would normally pay to preserve. Slight paper texture matters. The feeling of one layer sitting above another matters. A mouth arriving as a separate shape matters. The absence of natural joint movement matters. The show eventually gained the ability to create far more realistic images than anything seen in the pilot, but realism was not the target for the characters viewers had already accepted. The handmade process also created a useful kind of visual honesty. A paper character cannot pretend to be physically real. The audience accepts the rules immediately and stops expecting realistic movement. That gives the writing enormous room. Jesus can fight Santa. An alien can appear behind a child. A bus can run over Kenny. The image does not need to sell the event as physically convincing. It needs to make the event readable quickly enough for the joke to land. That speed of reading would become more important as the show became more topical. A simple character can be posed, altered, duplicated, and thrown into a new situation without requiring the production to teach the audience a new visual system each week. The limitation that made the pilot slow at the physical level produced designs that were extremely efficient at the storytelling level. Once those designs could be separated from the scissors and glue that created them, they had the potential to become much faster than they had ever been on the table. There was another reason the rough style became difficult to replace. It shaped the timing of the comedy. South Park rarely needs a character to perform a long physical reaction before a line can land. A pair of eyes can widen, a mouth can switch, a body can turn with a hard change in angle. The audience understands the reaction immediately, and the conversation keeps moving. That economy fits Parker and Stone's writing, where a scene can turn on a sudden insult, a quick reversal, or a character saying something absurd with almost no preparation. Smooth animation could add information that the joke does not need. The stiffness leaves the words in control. The same economy helps with characters who are designed around one strong visual idea. Kyle's hat covers most of his hair. Kenny's hood hides most of his face. Cartman's body is built around a large round coat. Mr. Garrison can be recognized from a small collection of pieces. Adults may gain more detail over the years, but the basic town remains readable at a glance. The early paper process rewarded designs that could survive being broken into separate movable parts, and those designs later rewarded a digital production that needed reusable pieces. A weakness in one production method became an advantage in the one that replaced it. That is also why the phrase cheap looking can be misleading. The earliest shorts were cheap in the literal sense that their materials were simple, but the look eventually became expensive to imitate accurately. Once the show had a staff, software, servers, and a television deadline, nobody was saving effort by keeping Cartman's arm stiff. The stiffness was being protected on purpose. A detail that once existed because the paper could not bend naturally now had to be reproduced by people working with tools that could make it bend any way they wanted. The shift changes the meaning of every later improvement. Better backgrounds, more complex effects, smoother camera movement, and larger crowds do not erase the first design language because the characters remain anchored to it. pilot. South Park can add detail around the boys, while keeping their bodies simple enough to look like the same objects from the table. The town can become richer without allowing the central figures to become ordinary animation. That balance starts here, before any software switch, because the pilot defines what later technology is allowed to improve and what it is expected to leave visibly crude. The original pilot, therefore, sits at an unusual point in South Park's history. It is both the purest version of the famous visual method and the clearest proof that the method could not continue unchanged. Every frame demonstrates what the series wanted to look like. Every month spent making those frames demonstrates why the series needed another way to get there. The surviving paper pieces make that contradiction physical. They are small, flat, ordinary objects that once had to be moved one position at a time to create a television character. Years later, South Park could build crowds, explosions, vehicles, fantasy worlds, and camera moves with tools the pilot did not have. Yet those tools would still be judged by whether the result looked related to the pieces sitting in storage. The strangest part is that the production had already learned what could not be lost before it had a sustainable way to preserve it. The solution would have to copy the drawings and the physical behavior of the material that made them. The first animation style did more than give South Park a starting point. It created a set of restrictions that the show chose to keep long after the restrictions stopped being necessary. The paper disappeared from ordinary production, but its behavior stayed behind as a rule. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The handmade process was gone, but the visual habits it created were now too recognizable to discard. Keeping those habits without scissors or glue meant finding a new production method that could move faster without making the same four boys suddenly feel like characters from a completely different cartoon. Section 2. The computer upgrade that had to look handmade. The paper characters had become recognizable, but the paper itself could not survive a weekly schedule. Computers offered speed, reuse, and easy revisions, which should have solved everything. Instead, the first digital versions exposed a new problem. South Park could become technically better and visually wrong at the same time. The change began with an unusual goal. Most animation teams adopt new software because they want the screen to show what the new software can do. South Park moved to computers because the physical pilot had shown that cutting and photographing every piece by hand could not keep up with series television. The new system needed to save labor while hiding the fact that anything fundamental had changed. That meant the original paper artwork remained part of the conversion instead of being discarded for cleaner computer drawings. The physical pieces were scanned. Their shapes and textures became source material for digital versions of the characters. Instead of asking a computer artist to draw a new Cartman from scratch, the production could build a digital Cartman whose pieces still carried the look of the construction paper used in the pilot. The software was far more advanced than the image it was being asked to imitate. The production used alias and wavefront tools running on Silicon Graphics hardware, equipment associated with serious computer animation at a time when ordinary home computers were nowhere near that level. Those tools could build three-dimensional scenes, move cameras, create smooth animation, and handle effects the original table could never produce. South Park used that power to make flat circles, coats, mouths, and mitten-shaped hands keep behaving like cutouts. The depth was there, even when the audience was not supposed to notice it. A digital character could be built from separate pieces placed on a virtual plane. One piece could sit a tiny distance above another, so that the computer produced a slight shadow resembling the shadow of layered paper. A face could still be made from independent eyes and mouths. The system was three-dimensional underneath, but the final image was arranged to look as if somebody had laid colored pieces on a flat surface. That solved one part of the problem. A digital mouth could be reused. An arm could be moved without cutting a new arm. A scene could be reopened if a joke changed. The crew no longer had to physically rebuild a character every time the script demanded another pose, but the software introduced a danger the paper never had. It could make the movement too smooth. The first computer-animated episodes did not immediately hit the exact texture and stiffness the crew wanted. Contemporary reporting from the period describes the digital result as looking too computer-generated. The improvement was visible in the wrong direction. The production had escaped the limitations of paper only to discover that audiences could feel when those limitations disappeared. That forced the animators to work against their tools. A computer wants to interpolate motion cleanly between one position and another. South Park often works better when a character seems to jump between positions. A three-dimensional system can rotate a head smoothly through space. The South Park head is supposed to feel closer to a prepared paper view being swapped for another one. The technology could create natural bends, but elbows and shoulders were often more convincing for this world when they remained blunt pieces. The digital system therefore had to learn bad habits on purpose. Movement could be restricted. Textures could keep the uneven paper feeling. Shadows could remain simple. The virtual camera could be held back. Expressions could still arrive as abrupt changes rather than smooth facial facial acting. The software was useful precisely because it gave the crew enough control to choose where sophistication would remain invisible. That choice affected comedy as much as appearance. Cartman can turn toward Kyle with almost no transition and deliver a line immediately. Kenny can be destroyed in a visually impossible way without the show spending time on realistic body mechanics. Mr. Garrison can hold an expression like a cardboard mask while saying something far more extreme than the face suggests. The characters stay readable because the animation does not compete with every line for attention. The early digital episodes became a period of adjustment. Some facial shapes changed. Eye lines and shadows became more consistent. Backgrounds could be handled with greater control. The production could correct things that had been difficult on the physical table. Yet the important improvement was not that South Park suddenly looked polished. It was that the crew became better at deciding which imperfections were part of the identity and which were merely accidents of the old process. A torn edge or a paper texture could be preserved because it helped the illusion. A production mistake did not have to be. A mouth could remain simple while its timing became more reliable. A character could retain stiff movement while the crew gained the ability to place that character precisely. The new pipeline separated the rough look from the rough working conditions that had created it. That separation is what made the television schedule possible. Reusable digital parts turned characters into systems. Stan did not need to be rebuilt from paper for each scene. His coat, face, eyes, mouth shapes, hands, and other pieces could exist as assets. The same principle applied to buildings, classrooms, vehicles, and background characters. Once those parts existed, a new episode could spend its effort arranging and changing them instead of manufacturing every visible object from the beginning. The change also gave the crew a new kind of consistency. With physical pieces, a slightly different cut or placement could change the way a character looked from one setup to another. Digital assets gave the production fixed shapes that could be called back whenever they were needed. The joke could still demand an ugly drawing or a distorted expression, but the normal version of a character no longer depended on somebody recreating it by hand that morning. That steadiness matters in a show where dozens of supporting characters can disappear for months and then return without needing to be redesigned. The backgrounds benefited in a different way. A paper character only needs enough scenery to establish where the conversation is happening, but a weekly series keeps returning to the same places. The bus stop, the school, the Marsh house, the Broflovsky house, and the streets of town become reusable environments. Digital production can keep those locations stable while changing props, weather, crowd size, or camera position around them. The town starts to feel more consistent, even though the people inside it remain deliberately flat. The computer also makes impossible transformations easier to stage without changing the basic character language. A head can swell, a body can split apart, an object can enter a scene from a strange angle. Those events would have required more physical construction on the table, but digital pieces can be duplicated, stretched, hidden, or replaced. The audience sees more extreme events, while the characters still look as if the same simple paper parts are being abused. That becomes one of South Park's most useful visual tricks, because gross or violent ideas can grow larger without forcing the series into realistic anatomy. The improvement is therefore easiest to notice at the edges. A familiar character may still have the same blunt body, but the shot can contain more layers. A crowd can become denser. A vehicle can move through the space more cleanly. Lighting and effects can be controlled instead of improvised with physical material. The production gains precision around the crude core, which lets the crude core remain readable rather than looking like the result of a crew that simply does not know how to make anything else. The gain became even clearer when the series moved into a feature film. South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, had to fill a cinema screen, support musical numbers, handle much larger crowds, create more elaborate effects, and sustain scenes with a scale the television pilot had never attempted. A movie could have been the moment the production abandoned the crude visual language and tried to prove that South Park could look like a conventional animated feature. The film chose another route. Its presentation became more ambitious, but the central characters still belonged to the cutout world. Stan did not suddenly gain a fully articulated body because the screen was larger. Cartman's mouth did not become naturalistic because he had a musical number. The backgrounds could carry more depth, and the effects could become richer, while the boys stayed tied to the same flat design rules that had come from construction paper. That balance is visible in the way the movie treats large spectacle. Fire, crowds, military scenes, hell, and musical staging can become more complex around characters who still move with the stubborn simplicity of television cutouts. The contrast lets the scale grow without making the boys feel as though they have wandered into a different franchise. The world expands, but the people remain visually anchored. The movie also proves that the cheap look was no longer actually cheap in the simple sense. A theatrical production demanded serious animation work, planning, effects, and compositing. The characters looked intentionally primitive because the production was spending effort to keep them that way. What had begun as an economical student method had had become a controlled aesthetic maintained inside professional software. That is the point where South Park's visual identity becomes independent of its materials. The show no longer needs real paper to look handmade, and it no longer needs a small production to look small. It can put a flat child beside a larger cinematic effect and still make both belong to the same world. The paper appearance has become a style rather than a process. The change also makes revisions far less destructive. On the physical pilot, altering one piece could require another physical setup and another photographed sequence. In the digital system, the crew can reopen a shot, move an asset, replace a mouth, shift a background, or adjust timing without cutting a new object. That freedom will later become essential to South Park's famously short production cycle. But even at this stage, it changes the relationship between writing and animation. A late idea no longer has to fight a table full of finished paper. The software also lets the production keep a growing library. A new adult can be built from existing logic. A familiar classroom can return without being recreated. A prop can be pulled from earlier work. The more episodes South Park makes, the more useful the digital system becomes, because every completed object can become part of the material available to the following weeks. That growing library does not force every episode to look identical. It creates a stable base from which the crew can break the rules. A paper style that once depended on physical limitation is now stored as a collection of choices. The production can decide to make a scene smoother, deeper, or stranger because it can always return to the familiar visual system afterward. The shift also changes what counts as an error. If a character suddenly moves with natural animation, that can feel more wrong than a stiff pose. If a texture becomes perfectly clean, it can break the illusion more than a deliberately rough surface. The digital crew inherits a backward standard, where technical excellence has to be filtered through the question of whether the image still feels handmade. That is why the early computer transition matters more than a simple software name. The show did not move from bad animation to good animation. It moved from a physical process to a digital imitation of that process, then spent several episodes learning how much of the original awkwardness had to be rebuilt before the imitation felt right. By the time the system settles, South Park has gained something the construction paper table could never offer. The crew can move faster, reuse work, revise scenes, expand the scale, and still make a viewer believe the same four children are made from the same cheap material. The technology has become invisible because the visible result is still supposed to look limited. The success of the imitation also changes the audience's relationship with the style. Once viewers accept the digital version as South Park, the production no longer has to prove that the characters are literally handmade. The important promise is visual continuity. The show can replace the entire method underneath them as long as the boys still seem to obey the same physical rules when they appear on screen. The scanned paper texture is the clearest object left behind by that transition, because it links the physical pilot directly to the digital series that followed. A physical sheet once carried the color and grain of a character because it actually was the character. After the switch, the same kind of surface can be attached to a digital object that exists in three-dimensional software. The image remembers the paper even when no paper is moving. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Once the paper illusion no longer depended on physical paper, the machinery underneath could keep changing without announcing itself on screen. The town could gain new internal tools, deeper spaces, and larger libraries of reusable parts, while the same stubbornly flat faces remained in front. Section 3. The 3D engine hidden behind flat paper South Park kept looking like paper as its software became capable of full three-dimensional animation. Most of that complexity stayed hidden beneath flat faces and simple rooms, even as the production schedule became more demanding. The important change was not obvious in the finished picture to audiences at first. Between the 4th and 5th seasons, the animation department moved from Power Animator into Maya software. On the surface, the change was easy to miss. Stan still had the same round head. Cartman still moved like a set of stiff pieces. The town still looked flat enough to cut out and place on a table. Underneath those images, however, the production was becoming a much more organized three-dimensional system. Maya could handle the kind of work South Park normally chose not to display. It could rotate objects smoothly, move cameras through depth, simulate more natural motion, and build scenes that would have been impossible on the original construction paper table. The crew still used it to arrange characters whose arms, mouths, eyes, coats, and heads were meant to behave like flat parts. The software had become more powerful, while the visible rules stayed stubbornly limited. That made the show's simplicity useful in a new way. A complicated traditional character may need many drawings or a detailed digital rig to perform a scene naturally. A South Park character can often communicate the same story beat with a mouth change, an eye movement, a head turn, and a few blunt arm positions. When thousands of decisions have to be made inside a short production cycle, every unnecessary movement becomes time that could have gone somewhere else. The production built a library around that economy. Characters could be stored as reusable assets. Familiar rooms could return turn. Mouth shapes, clothing pieces, props, vehicles, and background elements could be pulled into a new scene instead of recreated. When a new character appeared, the crew could often start from established systems rather than from an empty screen. The more South Park produced, the larger that library became, and the more quickly a new episode could turn words on a page into something ready for animation. That speed mattered because Parker and Stone were not trying to lock the story weeks in advance. South Park developed a production cycle where writing, recording, storyboarding, animation, editing, and revision could happen within the same compressed stretch of days. The famous 6-day schedule was not a marketing label added after the fact. The studio documented individual episodes moving from idea to broadcast inside roughly that rhythm, and the documentary 6 Days to Air later showed the process directly. The pressure changes what good technology means. A beautiful new effect is not useful if it takes so long that the episode has to be frozen earlier. A more advanced character system is not automatically better if every change becomes harder to render. Members of the production have described a practical rule that new tools could not be allowed to slow the pipeline. South Park would rather keep a simple method that could be changed quickly than gain a polished feature that trapped the episode in yesterday's version of the script. That philosophy reaches all the way back to the physical pilot. Construction paper had made late changes expensive because every altered visual required more manual work. The digital pipeline solved that problem gradually. A line could change, then a mouth timing could change with it. A prop could be moved. A background could be adjusted. A scene could be shortened. A new shot could be built from existing pieces. The production was no longer locked to whatever had been photographed first. The schedule also changed the relationship between current events and animation. Most animated shows cannot react to something that happened a few days before broadcast because their episodes were visually completed months earlier. South Park could build stories around recent politics, celebrity news, sports, or public controversies because the animation system was designed to follow the writing rather than force the writing to stop early. That does not mean every episode was created from nothing in 6 identical days. Ideas could exist before a production week. Reusable assets came from years of earlier work. Some sequences demanded more preparation. The important fact is that the normal pipeline remained unusually open to revision during the final run toward air. The visual simplicity made that possible because many shots could be rebuilt without the labor a more detailed cartoon would require. The day-by-day production records show how little separation existed between departments. A script change was not a distant problem for animators working months later. It could become a new board, a new recording, a retake, or an altered shot during the same week. Parker could watch material, decide it was not working, and send it back while other parts of the episode were still being assembled. The show looked crude, partly because crude shapes are forgiving under that kind of pressure. The growing digital system also meant complexity could be hidden where it helped. Crowds could be built from more assets. Vehicles could move with greater control. Effects could be layered over flat characters. Cameras could travel through spaces when the joke needed them to. A normal conversation between 4 boys did not need to display any of that. The production could reserve visible sophistication for moments where it actually changed the scene. That restraint is one reason later South Park can contain sequences that look far more elaborate than the early seasons without making ordinary scenes feel redesigned. The technology does not require the house style to evolve at the same speed. A fire can become more convincing while Cartman's hand remains a mitten. A town shot can gain depth while Kyle's face remains a stack of circles and simple mouth shapes. Different parts of the image are allowed to advance at different rates. The value of the library becomes clearest when a script suddenly asks for something familiar in a different setting. Cartman may need a costume added to a body the crew already has. A classroom may need to be filled with a larger crowd. A celebrity may need to stand beside characters built years earlier. Digital parts make those changes modular. The crew can spend its limited time on what is new instead of rebuilding what the audience already understands. That is the kind of efficiency that rarely calls attention to itself on screen, but it is what makes an aggressive deadline survivable. Voices fit into the same pattern. South Park can record dialogue late because mouths are built from a limited visual vocabulary. A new line does not require every syllable to be redrawn through detailed lip movement. The mouth shapes only need to sell the rhythm clearly enough for the performance to read. That choice leaves the voice actors, editing, and timing in control of the joke while the animation follows quickly. The flat face, which began as a limitation of paper pieces, becomes an advantage when a line is still changing close to delivery. The production can also hide unfinished complexity until the last possible moment. A rough layout can establish timing before every visual element is final. Shots can move through stages while the broader episode is still being reshaped. Retakes do not always mean starting again because the character, location, and basic camera setup may already exist. The ability to preserve useful work while changing only the part that failed is exactly what the physical pilot lacked. That flexibility became part of South Park's creative reputation. Topical episodes episodes could refer to events that other animated series would have had no time to touch. Political developments could be folded into stories while they were still fresh. Public figures could appear quickly because the style did not require months of model development and subtle acting. The visual language that looked primitive from the outside was supporting a production method that behaved more like live television than ordinary animation. The same system makes stylistic departures less dangerous. If the core characters and locations are stable assets, one episode can spend time on a special visual language without rebuilding the entire series around it. The production can leave the normal look for a few minutes and return to it immediately because the normal world is already stored, rigged, and ready. That possibility becomes important once the show starts using anime, game footage, rotoscoping, live action, and other forms that would have been much harder to manage inside the original physical process. The strongest proof that South Park had been three-dimensional underneath for years arrived when the opening titles were redesigned for season 17. The title sequence suddenly let the town behave like a physical miniature. The camera moved through a world with visible depth. Buildings, roads, snow, and characters occupied space in a way the ordinary episodes usually flatten out. The familiar paper style was still there, but it looked as though someone had stood the pieces upright and allowed a camera to fly between them. That sequence did not reveal a brand new idea so much as expose the hidden logic of the production. South Park had long been built inside three-dimensional software. Ordinary episodes used textures, camera choices, and staging to suppress much of that depth. The title sequence stopped suppressing it. Viewers were allowed to see a version of the town closer to the machinery that had been supporting the flat image for years. The result creates another South Park contradiction. The most visibly three-dimensional version of the town still works because everything looks handmade. Snow resembles material. Buildings resemble models. Characters still read as cutouts. The depth changes, but the surfaces continue pointing back toward the original craft table. The production does not use three-dimensional space to erase the handmade identity. It uses three-dimensional space to turn that identity into a miniature world. The opening also demonstrates how far the studio's relationship with its original limitations has changed. In 1997, depth was a physical fact created by layers of paper on a table. By season 17, depth could be calculated, moved through, reduced, exaggerated, or hidden. The crew controlled something the original materials had controlled for them. That freedom was the real technological upgrade. Speed remained the more important benefit during ordinary production. A title sequence could spend time showing off the dimensional system because it was reused. Weekly scenes needed to remain efficient. The show could not afford to treat every conversation like a cinematic demonstration of Maya. The point of the technology was to disappear until a story required it. That explains why the characters can look almost unchanged across eras where the production beneath them is completely different. The visual identity lives at the output level. Parker and Stone can replace software, improve render systems, expand the asset library, and change internal tools while keeping the audience focused on the same simple faces. The pipeline is allowed to evolve because the paper illusion has become portable. The compressed schedule also produces a particular kind of creative risk. A team that can change material late is tempted to keep changing it late. The documentary record shows long hours, last-minute decisions, and the possibility that a central idea may still be developing while finished shots already exist elsewhere in the episode. That process can be exhausting, but it also means South Park can discover a better version of a joke after a slower production would have been forced to keep the first one. The style and the schedule therefore reinforce each other. Simple visuals allow late changes. Late changes reward simple visuals. Reusable assets make the weak possible. The weak gives the assets a reason to stay reusable. A show that began looking crude because its creators had limited resources eventually keeps looking crude because that crudeness supports a production system built around creative flexibility. That hidden discipline is easy to miss because the final episode rarely advertises the amount of revision behind it. A scene can look as blunt and effortless as something assembled from paper even after writers, editors, animators, and sound staff have changed it repeatedly. The better the pipeline works, the less the audience needs to notice the pipeline at all. The season 17 town is the cleanest image of what happened beneath the screen. It turns years of hidden production logic into something visible without asking the main characters to stop looking like the same crude cutouts audiences already knew so well. The camera can move through real depth, past physical-looking buildings and layered characters, because the world has been constructed with technology that no longer resembles a table covered in paper, yet the entire sequence is designed to make that technology look like a more elaborate version of the same table. By then, South Park does not need three-dimensional software to prove that it can animate well. It needs three-dimensional software to protect the right to look flat, to change late, and to break its own visual rules only when the story gives it a reason. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A flexible digital world could keep the boys boys looking like paper forever. The first major break came when their own imaginations demanded bodies that looked faster, stronger, and far more heroic than anything their ordinary stiff shapes could convincingly become. Section 4. The anime fantasy that made the boys look powerful. The boys have always turned ordinary games into something larger in their heads. Then one episode gives them real martial arts weapons, and suddenly their usual paper bodies are not enough. The fantasy needs a new visual language, one that can make 4 children look like dangerous warriors. The episode Good Times with Weapons, which originally aired on March 17, 2004, as Season 8, Episode 1, begins at the Park County Fair, where Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny find a vendor selling martial arts weapons. They are children, the weapons are real, and the seller's first response should end the purchase immediately. Instead, the boys lie about their ages and leave with enough equipment to turn an afternoon game into something far more dangerous than their usual backyard play. The moment the boys begin imagining themselves as ninjas, the episode stops looking like ordinary South Park. Their round heads stretch into sharper faces, their bodies become tall and muscular, hair moves dramatically, eyes narrow, clothes gain folds and detail, weapons flash through carefully posed attacks. The change is so large that the characters look less like improved versions of themselves than alternate people wearing the same colors and personalities. That difference is the point. In the ordinary world, Stan is a 4th grader with a weapon he should not own. In the anime world, he looks like someone trained to use it. Kenny becomes a silent fighter whose hood has been replaced by a far more heroic design. Kyle and Cartman gain the kind of bodies and expressions their normal paper forms cannot support. The style supplies skill before any of the boys have earned it. The fantasy also gives them powers. They shout attacks, imagine dramatic movement, and treat their fight as though every pose has the weight of an epic battle. The animation makes their self-image visible without requiring them to explain it. They are not thinking of themselves as children waving sharp objects around a yard. They are thinking of themselves as warriors whose abilities are obvious because the world suddenly looks like a television anime built around them. Butters creates the first serious complication. He arrives as Professor Chaos, the supervillain identity he uses when he wants to oppose the boys. The fantasy absorbs him immediately. In the anime version, Professor Chaos becomes a proper villain with an imposing design and enough visual presence to belong in the same dramatic world. The children do not have to agree on whether their game is real. The animation has already agreed for them. That confidence collapses when Kenny throws a shuriken. In the fantasy, the attack belongs to the same exaggerated combat language as everything around it. In the ordinary world, the weapon is a piece of metal moving toward a child's face. It strikes Butters in the episode returns to the normal South Park look because there is no heroic version of the injury that can make it harmless. Butters is standing there with a real throwing star lodged in his eye. The boys' anime bodies vanish. Their imaginary skill vanishes with them. What remains are 4 children who bought weapons they were not supposed to have and have now badly injured another child. That is the first major collision between the two styles. The anime sequences show the version of events the boys want to inhabit. The paper world is where consequences stay attached to bodies. A sword can feel weightless in fantasy and still cut in ordinary reality. A shuriken can look like part of an attack sequence and still end up stuck in Butters. The sensible response would be to find an adult and get medical help. The boys immediately think about punishment instead. Their parents will discover the weapons. The fair vendor will become part of the story. Everything about the purchase they lied to make will be exposed. Protecting themselves becomes more important than explaining why Butters has a metal star in his face. Their solution is to disguise him as a dog. They dress Butters in a costume, force him into the role, and try to take him to a veterinarian rather than a hospital. The idea is absurd enough that the normal animation becomes useful again. There is no anime heroism left in the plan. Butters is injured, frightened, and being dragged through a humiliating disguise while the boys try to protect their own secret. The dog disguise also shows how easily the boys can change the visual story around a person without changing the physical problem underneath. Butters can be covered in fur and made to move like an animal, but the shuriken remains in his eye. The image they present to adults is false, while the evidence of what happened cannot be hidden completely. The trip with Butters also reveals something the anime fantasy hides about teamwork. When the boys are warriors, they move like a coordinated group. Each person seems to know his role, and their poses make the group look disciplined. Once a real problem appears, that coordination is mostly self-protection. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny argue about what will get them caught, what excuse can work, and how to move Butters without admitting what happened. The polished team only exists when the consequences are imaginary. The alternate art also changes the emotional scale of ordinary arguments. Cartman can look like a dangerous rival when the anime begins, even though his normal body remains a round child in a red coat. Kenny can appear mysterious rather than muffled. Kyle's anger can be sharpened into the kind of expression the paper face normally cannot hold. Those choices are not random decoration. They convert familiar personality traits into the visual language of action heroes, letting the boys see their own ordinary conflicts as something much grander. Even the music and staging support that self-image. The fights are presented with the confidence of a genre that expects dramatic attacks to matter. Then the episode cuts back to a world where the same children can barely solve the practical problem of getting an injured friend medical attention. The visual gap does more than make the anime funny. It makes the normal South Park designs look especially small and helpless, immediately after the fantasy has made the same characters seem capable of anything. The boys encounter another group of children with weapons, and the ninja fantasy returns. The anime style again makes the confrontation look organized, impressive, and controlled. Each child has an identity. Each attack feels deliberate. The weapons belong to a world where training and power seem natural. That second burst of fantasy matters, because the first one has already caused a real injury. The boys have evidence that their game is dangerous, yet they still slip back into the visual world that makes danger feel like competence. The anime does not disappear once reality proves it false. It becomes tempting again, because it is the version where the children look like they know what they are doing. Cartman takes that confidence further than anyone else. He develops what he believes is an invisibility technique. Inside the ninja fantasy, such an ability makes sense. The entire style is built around impossible powers, exaggerated movement, and children imagining that they have become something larger than themselves. Cartman accepts the logic completely. He decides the invisibility will allow him to move through the world without being seen. To make the plan work, he removes his clothes. The reasoning is consistent with his fantasy. If his body becomes invisible but his clothing does not, then clothing would reveal his location. The mistake is not in the internal logic. The mistake is believing that the internal logic has any control over the ordinary world. Cartman walks into a public event naked, convinced nobody can see him. The anime confidence remains in his head. The episode shows everyone else the ordinary South Park body standing fully exposed in front of a crowd. That is the strongest use of the style change, because no weapon has to fail and no adult has to explain the difference. Cartman's own behavior becomes proof that he has mistaken imagination for physical reality. He trusts the heroic version of himself so completely that he lets the ordinary world test it in the most public way possible. The adults react, but their reaction creates another South Park problem. Public nudity becomes the scandal that dominates attention. The parents are horrified by what Cartman has done. The children had spent the day carrying dangerous martial arts weapons, and Butters has a severe eye injury because one of those weapons was thrown at him. Yet the naked child becomes easier for the adults to focus on than the objects that cause the real physical harm. That reversal protects the weapons from the full response they should have received. The boys' original mistake becomes part of a larger argument about what adults notice and what they decide is offensive. A metal star in a child's eye is the direct consequence of the ninja fantasy. Cartman's body becomes the thing the town can discuss without facing the more difficult fact that children were able to purchase dangerous equipment in the first place. The anime sequences make that misplaced attention sharper. When the boys imagine the weapons, everything looks exciting. The danger has style. Their movements have purpose. When Cartman is exposed, the ordinary visual world is deliberately plain and embarrassing. The adults react more strongly to the embarrassing image than to the exciting one, even though the exciting image was covering behavior that actually hurt someone. Butters receives the worst of both realities. In fantasy, he is a villain worthy of a dramatic fight. In ordinary reality, he is the child injured by that fight and then disguised as a dog so his friends can avoid punishment. He gets none of the power that the anime design gives Professor Chaos. The style flatters the people imagining it, not the person paying for their mistake. The episode eventually returns the boys to their normal designs because their fantasy cannot remain the main reality. That reset does not make the weapons harmless. The objects still exist. They still came from the fair. The shuriken still injured Butters. The children are able to move on because South Park returns to its usual visual world faster than real responsibility catches up with them. The important difference between the two styles is their function. The anime world is what the boys believe action should feel like. It gives them bodies with discipline, speed, and control. The normal cutout world removes those claims and shows blunt children making bad decisions with objects that do not care how heroic the children feel. That is also why ordinary South Park could not have carried the entire joke by itself. The boys could have said they felt like ninjas. They could have struck poses. They could have shouted attack names. The audience would understand that they were pretending. The anime sequences make the fantasy seductive enough that the return to ordinary bodies has impact. The gap can be seen instead of explained. The production already had the ability to animate more elaborate images by 2004, but Good Times with Weapons does not use that ability as a permanent upgrade. The anime disappears whenever the story needs the children to face the world they actually inhabit. South Park proves it can look dramatically different and then refuses to keep the improvement because the contrast is more useful than either either style alone. The same rule applies to Professor Chaos. His normal costume is deliberately cheap, a child's homemade attempt at a supervillain. The anime version gives the identity the power Butters wants it to have. When the fantasy drops away, the costume becomes cardboard and cloth again, and Butters becomes the vulnerable child underneath it. That makes the visual change an unusually precise character tool. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, Kenny, and Butters all see themselves differently when the anime begins. The alternate designs are not neutral. They are flattering. They make the children taller, sharper, stronger, and more capable. The ordinary designs are funny, partly because they expose how large the distance is between that self-image and reality. That contrast also protects the normal style from becoming visually stale. The paper designs can remain deliberately limited because the show can escape them whenever a story benefits from another form. Returning to the old bodies after the anime makes their stiffness feel purposeful again, rather than merely old. The shuriken is the object that connects both worlds. In anime, it belongs to a dramatic attack. In ordinary South Park, it is still the same sharp piece of metal. The style around it can change completely, but the object does not change with the fantasy. Butters learns that before anyone else. By the end, the boys can return to their familiar paper bodies and continue being children. The weapon remains proof that the anime version of the afternoon was never harmless imagination. The fantasy made them look powerful for a while. Reality kept the part that could actually hurt someone afterward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The ninja fantasy disappears whenever ordinary reality has to correct it. A digital world creates a harder boundary when the boys can actually enter it, build stronger bodies inside it, and depend on an outside game company to help construct the place where their fight happens. Section 5. The video game world South Park had to enter. For real, South Park had parodied games without leaving its own visual world. But when the boys begin living two lives at once, their avatars grow stronger while their real bodies collapse. The story needs two visual languages that can stay separate while still affecting each other. Make Love, Not Warcraft arrived on October 4th, 2006 as Season 10, Episode 8, with Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny already regular World of Warcraft players. Their routine sessions change when another player starts killing their avatars with almost no effort. Losing once would be annoying, but he keeps returning and is powerful enough that ordinary players have no practical way to stop him. The game footage immediately creates a kind of body double. Stan has the familiar South Park body sitting at a computer, but he also has an avatar moving through Azeroth. Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny have the same split. Their physical bodies remain short, round, and stiff. Their online bodies belong to a game with a completely different visual grammar, where armor, weapons, terrain, and movement follow rules South Park never tries to imitate in ordinary scenes. The difference matters because the threat only exists in one of those worlds at first. The rogue player is not standing outside Stan's house. He is not waiting near the school. He can ruin the boys' evening by killing the characters they control, but their actual bodies are safe. That should make the problem easy to walk away from. Instead, the distance between avatar and child makes the boys more willing to reorganize their lives around winning. The episode also uses the interface between those worlds for small jokes that would disappear if everything were redrawn in the same style. The avatars can stand in a detailed fantasy environment, while the voices remain unmistakably Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. Their personalities travel into bodies that do not resemble them. Cartman can still order everyone around, Kyle can still challenge him, and the game can still look completely serious, while the conversation belongs to South Park. That separation makes death work differently too. Kenny dying in Colorado is one of the show's oldest running jokes, but an avatar dying in Warcraft is a temporary setback. The player returns, the character can try again, and the cost is mainly lost time and frustration. The rogue player is frightening because he can repeat that temporary defeat so efficiently that the boys are unable to enjoy the game at all. Violence that would be extreme in the paper world becomes routine inside the game world, which gives the episode another reason to keep the visual systems separate. The parents have the opposite problem. They can see the physical deterioration because that is the world they occupy. They cannot feel the accumulated value of the avatars because the levels, items, and repeated tasks only make sense inside the game. The boys have created a second economy of effort where sitting still for months can count as progress. Their bodies say they are doing nothing. Their character statistics say they are getting better every day. Blizzard notices the same player because the problem has grown beyond a few children. Even the people responsible for the game cannot control him through normal play. The company's own attempts fail. The situation is framed with the seriousness of a crisis, while the person causing it is still sitting at a computer somewhere, using a character inside a commercial game. The boys initially try to fight in the obvious way. Other players join them. Numbers increase, and the resistance looks impressive for a moment. The rogue player cuts through them. An army of avatars can be defeated because the the difference in levels is too large. The boys do not lack courage or teammates. They lack the numerical power the game uses to decide what a character can survive. Cartman finds the answer inside those rules. They cannot win through a clever attack yet, so they need to become stronger first. That means leveling through repetitive low-risk actions for an enormous amount of time. The plan is boring, slow, and perfectly matched to the system they are trying to beat. The children will spend months doing almost nothing interesting inside the game so that their numbers eventually become large enough for one interesting fight. This is where the two visual worlds begin moving in opposite directions. Inside Warcraft, their characters gain levels, equipment improves, statistics rise, the avatars become increasingly capable of surviving the environment. In South Park, the children become less capable of ordinary life. They stop going outside. They sit for long stretches. Their bodies gain weight. Their skin changes. Their movement becomes more difficult. The stronger the heroic digital body becomes, the more neglected the physical body controlling it looks. The episode can show that contradiction instantly because it does not have to redraw Warcraft into South Park's house style. The game world looks like the game. The boys' room looks like South Park. Cutting between them makes the exchange visible. One body is being trained through endless repetition, while the other is being abandoned in a chair. Their parents see the physical result and struggle to understand the value the boys attach to the digital one. Randy can look at Stan and see a child who has stopped living normally. Stan can look at the screen and see months of work becoming a character capable of doing something nobody else has managed. Both views are accurate within their own environment, which is why simply telling the boys to stop does not feel like an answer to them. Cartman pushes the physical neglect furthest because interruption threatens the leveling schedule. Ordinary needs become problems to solve without leaving the computer. The episode takes that idea into deliberately disgusting territory, but the purpose is clear. Every minute spent caring for the real body is a minute not being spent improving the avatar. The game has become the place where progress is measured, so the physical world is treated like maintenance. The production faced a similar problem from the opposite direction. South Park could have drawn a parody of World of Warcraft using its usual animation. That would have made the reference clear, but it would have weakened the division between the boys and their online selves. Instead, the episode uses material created in Blizzard's actual game environment. South Park Studios later explained that the team first experimented with creating Warcraft-style imagery itself. Blizzard became involved directly. Staff from the game company worked with the South Park production, and most of the major action footage was captured inside World of Warcraft before being brought into South Park's pipeline for additional work. That turns the game into something close to a filming location. Trey Parker could direct players inside the digital environment, telling them where to move and how a battle needed to unfold, in much the same way a director would organize performers on a set. For one large sequence, roughly 20 players were coordinated inside the game. The footage was then integrated with the rest of the episode. The method fits the story unusually well. The fictional boys are controlling avatars inside Warcraft. The real production is controlling players inside Warcraft to create the scenes. The boundary between South Park and Blizzard exists both inside the plot and behind it. Blizzard's role also raises the scale of the conflict. The company has a special weapon, the Sword of 1,000 Truths, that may give the boys a chance against the rogue player. The item belongs to the game world, but access to it depends on decisions made by people outside that world. The plot now needs something to cross the same boundary the animation has been crossing all episode. Randy becomes the physical link. The boys are committed to the battle online, while adults in the real world have to move information and access toward them. Randy does not suddenly become a Warcraft hero in his living room. His job is to reach Stan so that the digital character can receive what it needs. The final battle works because both realities matter at the same time. Inside Warcraft, the boys have finally built avatars strong enough to survive the encounter. Their months of grinding have produced the levels they needed. The rogue player is still dangerous, and the fight depends on the rules of the game rather than on anything their physical bodies can do. Outside the game, Randy has to keep the connection alive. The physical world supplies the people, computers, communication, and last piece of the plan. The boys cannot win if their avatars are weak, but the avatars cannot solve everything alone. The episode has spent its running time separating the two lives, then forces them to cooperate at the moment that matters most. The captured game footage makes that convergence feel different from a normal parody. South Park is not showing four paper children pretending to be fantasy fighters. It is showing the actual visual environment the boys have sacrificed their physical lives to inhabit. The digital landscape has enough independence to feel like somewhere else, which is exactly what the story needs. The rogue player is finally defeated. The victory should be the end of the obsession because the entire training plan existed to reach this result. The boys have conquered the threat that made normal play impossible. They can stand up, leave the computers, and return to the lives they neglected. Instead, they ask what they are supposed to do now. The answer is to play the game. That joke lands because the episode has treated months of gameplay as preparation exploration rather than recreation. Every boring task, every level gained, and every physical sacrifice was work performed so that normal entertainment could resume. The boys become masters of the game only to reach the point where they can finally use it casually again. Their real bodies do not receive the same instant reset. The avatars can win a battle and remain powerful. The children still carry the visible consequences of sitting in front of the computers for months. South Park can return them to their familiar designs in later stories, but within the episode, the physical cost remains present after the digital goal has been achieved. That makes the style change more than a joke about recognizing a popular game. The game footage is the only place where the boys' obsession makes them look successful. In South Park's ordinary art, success looks like 4 unhealthy children who have barely moved. In Warcraft, success looks like stronger characters, rare equipment, and the ability to survive an enemy who once destroyed everyone around them. The episode therefore gives each visual system a different truth. South Park shows what the obsession does to the players. Warcraft shows why the obsession feels like progress from inside it. Neither image can replace the other without losing half of the joke. The collaboration with Blizzard also proves how flexible South Park's production had become. The paper illusion no longer needs to swallow every outside medium and turn it into the same visual style. An episode can import another company's game engine, use it as footage, modify that material, and cut directly between the result and the familiar Colorado town without explaining why the image has changed. That freedom is a larger break from the early years than smoother shadows or more detailed backgrounds. The original pilot had one material language because almost everything was made from paper. By 2006, South Park could allow a second visual system to remain recognizably itself inside the program. The show did not need Warcraft to look like South Park. It needed the contrast to stay intact. The same choice protects the comedy around the parents. Randy's ordinary cutout body looks especially helpless beside the fantasy environment his son understands. He is trying to influence a world whose rules are displayed through another company's art, interfaces, and movement. The visual difference makes the generational gap concrete before anyone explains it. The production choice also avoids a weaker version of the joke. If South Park had simply copied Warcraft with paper cutouts, the game would feel like another costume placed over the same town. Using Blizzard's environment lets Azeroth keep its own visual authority, which makes returning to the boys' room feel like crossing a real boundary. The Sword of a Thousand Truths becomes the cleanest object connecting everything. It is created by people outside the battle, exists as power inside the game, and becomes useful only when the physical and digital worlds cooperate long enough to place it in the right hands. The sword can matter to Stan's avatar, even though Stan's actual body never holds it. When the boys finally return to ordinary play, the two bodies remain separated. The South Park children sit at their computers. The Warcraft avatars move through the world they spent months preparing to survive. The victory did not merge those realities. It only made the boys better at living in one while the other paid the cost. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A game engine could supply landscapes and movement that South Park never needed to imitate. Another altered world demanded bodies that felt less like paper and more physically alive, changing the weight and rhythm of motion without immediately revealing what gave that fantasy its strange texture. Section 6. The drug trip built from real human movement. Kenny has experienced impossible things without South Park abandoning its paper bodies. But when intoxication gives him taller figures, smoother movement, and a different sense of physical space, the fantasy needs a visual language that feels more human than the town around him. When Major Boobage originally aired on March 26, 2008, as Season 12, Episode 3, South Park had already spent years proving that its normal Maya pipeline could handle elaborate effects without abandoning the basic character design. Kenny's experience creates a different problem. The intoxicated world needs bodies, movement, and physical space that feel separate from ordinary Colorado before his desire to return there can make sense. That difference has to be visible before anyone explains it. The episode begins with Mr. Mackey trying to warn the students about ways people get high. His lesson is supposed to stop experimentation. Instead, naming one method gives the boys information they did not have before. Kenny hears that inhaling concentrated cat urine can produce an intense experience, and curiosity immediately becomes more useful than the warning attached to it. Kenny tests the method, and ordinary South Park disappears around him almost immediately. He enters a fantasy built as an open tribute to heavy metal, the 1981 animated film. His small hooded body is replaced by a tall, muscular human form. The women around him have exaggerated adult proportions. Vehicles, landscapes, skies, and movement all belong to a world far removed from the flat Colorado town. The change is not subtle enough to look like an upgrade. Kenny appears to have entered another animation culture entirely. That difference gives the intoxication a physical appeal. In South Park, Kenny is a child whose face is mostly hidden and whose body has the same tiny limbs problems as his classmates. Inside the hallucination, he is the kind of fantasy hero the normal model could never become. The drug gives him brighter colors and a body that can occupy a different kind of story. The experience ends, and Kenny wants to go back. That desire becomes the engine of his plot. The alternate animation is not a one-time visual joke because Kenny starts pursuing the condition that produces it. Each return makes the fantasy world feel more established, as though it exists somewhere he can visit if he performs the same action again. South Park responds to the trend in its usual way. Adults focus on the method, cats become the target, and the town begins treating access to animals as the problem that must be controlled. The ordinary visual world grows more restrictive. At the same time, Kenny's fantasy world becomes more attractive. One side is full of rules and panic. The other offers movement, power, sexuality, and escape. The town's response gives the episode a second visual joke. Cats remain drawn exactly as they normally are. They do not suddenly become dark or threatening because adults have decided they are connected to a drug problem. The danger is created by policy and panic, not by any change in the animals themselves. A harmless familiar pet can be treated like contraband, while the truly seductive image exists only inside Kenny's head. Kyle becomes part of that conflict because Gerald's family cannot stay outside the consequences once the older habit returns. Gerald is not introduced as someone seeking a new experience. He recognizes an old one. That gives the fantasy history. The world Kenny has just discovered is connected to an earlier period Gerald had already left behind, which makes the style feel less like a random hallucination and more like a visual form different people can fall back into under the same condition. Cartman's decision to hide cats pushes the ordinary plot into a parody of historical persecution. He takes the animals into his attic and treats the effort with a level of seriousness that sits strangely beside the actual reason the cats are being targeted. The episode can make that comparison without changing the art style at all. Colorado remains visually ordinary, while its adults behave as though a civic emergency exists. The calm paper world becomes the place where irrational policy looks official. That contrast strengthens every return to Kenny's fantasy. The ordinary town is busy creating rules, searches, and fear around animals. The hallucinated world has no interest in those rules. It offers immediate reward. Kenny does not need to win an argument or persuade anyone. He performs the act, the paper world disappears, and the richer animated body takes over. The style itself becomes the reason the behavior is easy to understand, even when nobody around him approves of it. Cartman's role creates another path through the conflict. He ends up hiding cats, turning his home into a parody of stories about people sheltering the persecuted. The joke is deliberately excessive, but it keeps the town's response inside the familiar South Park look. The more seriously the adults treat the cat crackdown, the stranger Kenny's private animated paradise feels beside it. Gerald Broflovsky adds the history the boys do not expect. The drug is not merely a new fad discovered by children. Gerald knows the experience from his own past. That recognition gives him a vulnerability he would rather keep buried, and once he returns to the behavior, Kenny is no longer alone in entering the fantasy. Gerald's involvement changes the alternate world because an adult with a normal suburban life is now carrying the same hidden desire. In Colorado, he is Kyle's father, a lawyer, and a man who generally expects to be treated as responsible. Under the influence, he is pulled into the same exaggerated fantasy language that transforms Kenny. The style removes the difference between respectable adult and reckless child because both become bodies inside the same hallucinated universe. The episode eventually lets those fantasies collide. Kenny and Gerald are no longer taking separate trips that happen to share a visual reference. Their altered experiences become part of a larger confrontation. The movement becomes dramatic, the bodies become heroic, and the staging follows the kind of fantasy action the normal South Park rigs are designed to avoid. The ordinary world eventually provides its own much less flattering view of the same behavior. That contrast is essential. Inside the fantasy, movement has weight and flow. Characters can hold poses, travel through space, and fight with a physical grace South Park normally has no interest in producing. Outside the hallucination, the same people are still ordinary bodies reacting to intoxication. The gap turns spectacle into embarrassment without needing anyone to explain why the fantasy is unreliable. The production had to solve that difference at a deeper level than simply drawing more detailed models. South Park Studios documented the process while the episode was being made. Large parts of the fantasy sequences began as live-action footage. Performers were filmed, including material shot against green screen, and the animation team then traced the movement frame by frame to create the final look. That process is rotoscoping. It begins with real motion rather than asking an animator to invent every position from scratch. A performer raises an arm, shifts weight, turns, or moves through a shot. The artist follows that photographed movement with drawing. The result can look illustrated while retaining the timing and body mechanics of a real person. For South Park, that matters because the normal style is built around avoiding those mechanics. Stan does not need a realistic shoulder roll to turn around. Cartman does not shift his weight naturally every time he walks. Kenny's normal body is intentionally too simple to perform the kind of sensual or heroic motion the hallucination demands. Rotoscoping starts from the opposite end. It brings human movement in first and builds the drawing on top of it. The production therefore breaks one of South Park's oldest rules at the level of movement rather than merely design. Good Times with Weapons could give the boys anime bodies and poses while still treating the sequence as conventional animation. Major Boobage wants the fantasy to feel physically different. The easiest way to make that difference convincing is to place real bodies underneath the images. That also explains why the alternate animation feels strange even when the technique is difficult to identify. Human movement contains small shifts that South Park usually removes. Weight transfers. Hips and shoulders respond to each other. Hands travel through arcs instead of snapping between prepared positions. Faces and bodies occupy more complex angles. The fantasy seems fluid because a person has already performed the motion before the artist draws over it. The method creates another version of South Park's old contradiction. The original series used computers to imitate paper. Here, the production uses live human movement to create a drawn fantasy. The finished image hides the thing that gives it its physical quality. A real performer disappears underneath an animated body, just as a three-dimensional Maya rig normally disappears underneath a flat paper texture. The difference is that Major Boobage wants viewers to feel the hidden source. The fantasy should seem more bodily than Colorado. Kenny's drug experience needs to offer something his normal world cannot. The production spends extra effort giving the hallucination a physical richness so that returning to flat cutouts feels like losing something. That loss helps explain Kenny's behavior. The episode makes the reward of the chemical effect concrete for him. He can move through a world where his body is taller, stronger, and central to a heroic fantasy. The ordinary Kenny cannot even speak clearly enough for most adults to understand him. The alternate animation gives him a form that commands attention. Gerald's presence makes the temptation less childish. He is old enough to know the consequences and still falls back into the experience. The animation gives his relapse a visible reward rather than presenting it only as bad judgment. He is escaping into a style where his ordinary responsibilities disappear along with his ordinary body. The town's ban on cats cannot reach that reward directly. It can remove access. It can punish ownership. It can turn animals into contraband. But it cannot make the fantasy less appealing to somebody who has already seen it. That is why the crackdown grows while the underlying desire survives. The heavy metal reference also works because it belongs to a very different era and tone of animation. South Park's paper world is blunt, childlike, and deliberately limited. The fantasy is adult, lush, and interested in bodies. Putting those visual languages side by side creates a joke before any character reacts. Kenny has escaped from one kind of cartoon into another kind of cartoon that promises him everything his normal design leaves out. The episode eventually pulls the characters back. Cats stop being the center of a town-wide panic. Gerald has to return to his family. Kenny has to return to the same hooded body he had before the first experience. The fantasy does not permanently redesign anyone because its value comes from remaining a place they can lose. That temporary nature also protects the house style. South Park can spend a large part of an episode looking radically different without suggesting that the normal animation has become outdated. The ordinary cutouts are necessary because they are the reality against which the fantasy is measured. If the entire series moved with rotoscoped human bodies afterward, the hallucination would stop feeling like a hallucination. The episode also avoids treating rotoscoping as a permanent prestige upgrade. The smoother bodies are desirable only because Kenny is escaping into them. Their beauty is part of the temptation. When the story returns to Colorado, the old stiffness becomes useful again because it restores the ordinary scale of the characters and makes the fantasy feel like somewhere they cannot remain. The live-action source footage gives the strongest production image. Before Kenny's fantasy hero could move through a drawn landscape, a real performer had to make that movement with an actual body. The animation team then covered the performer with a new illustrated form, keeping the motion while removing the person who supplied it. That process takes South Park farther from construction paper than almost anything before it. The original characters moved because hands pushed flat pieces between photographs. The fantasy characters move because human bodies were filmed first. Both methods begin in the physical world, but one deliberately removes natural motion and the other deliberately preserves it. The result is a style change that cannot be reduced to better drawing. Kenny's altered world feels different because its bodies obey different physics. The episode wants the audience to feel that change every time he crosses the boundary, then feel the loss of it when he comes back. The final value of the rotoscoping is simple because it gives the fantasy something the normal South Park models were never built to provide in ordinary scenes. It gives Kenny's escape a body South Park could not normally give him. Under the drawings are real shoulders, real weight, real movement, and real performers. When the intoxication ends, all of that physical detail disappears and the little orange hood returns. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The altered world still returns to normal animation when the trip ends, leaving the audience safely behind a drawn surface. A mock survival story would test that boundary from another direction by making the familiar animated bodies themselves part of an increasingly unreliable documentary reconstruction. Section 7. The live-action reenactment that replaced the boys. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny stay recognizable even when South Park experiments around them. A routine spring break outing becomes a mock survival documentary, and the joke keeps escalating until the familiar animated bodies themselves are no longer enough to sell the version of events being presented. Originally aired on April 18, 2012 as Season 16, Episode 6, I Should Have Never Gone Ziplining begins during spring break, when Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny choose an outdoor activity for their final day off. By then, South Park had already experimented with anime, game footage, rotoscoping, and increasingly complex digital effects without replacing the boys themselves, making their familiar animated bodies something the episode can safely put under pressure. The activity sounds memorable when it is still only a plan. None of the boys is especially committed to ziplining itself. They want a story worth telling afterward, and the promise of speed and height sounds exciting enough before the organized tour begins controlling how the day actually unfolds. The experience immediately turns into waiting. They have to listen to instructions. They have to stand with other tourists. They have to learn safety rules. They have to hear people make the same small talk repeatedly. The zipline itself lasts only a short time compared with everything required before and after it. South Park frames that boredom like a survival documentary. A narrator describes ordinary discomfort with the gravity normally used for illness, starvation, or disaster. The boys are given interview moments where their frustration is treated as testimony. Small physical problems are explained as though scientists are reconstructing a deadly event. That framing creates the first visual change without leaving animation. Ordinary South Park images are being edited and narrated as though they are documentary evidence. The boys still look exactly like themselves, but the language around them insists they are trapped in an ordeal worthy of a serious cable program. Cartman's body becomes part of the parody. His diet, his digestive problems, and his increasingly urgent need for a bathroom are described with the kind of biological detail that makes a boring tourist outing sound dangerous. The narrator can turn a normal bodily function into a chain reaction. South Park's simple visual style makes the explanation funnier because the audience is looking at the same blunt cartoon body while hearing an overly serious account of what is supposedly happening inside it. The narrator even gives the trip a false scientific logic. Boredom is treated as a measurable threat. Cartman's digestive system becomes part of the danger analysis. The camera pauses on ordinary details as though they are clues recovered after a disaster. Nothing about the drawings needs to change because the parody comes from the authority of the presentation. The same crude image can feel ridiculous or ominous, depending on the voice placed over it. That is important preparation for the live-action break. The episode first teaches the audience that documentary language can distort familiar images without changing the images themselves. Once that language has been accepted, replacing the animation becomes the largest possible escalation. The production can claim that the cartoon was only a dramatization and that a filmed reconstruction is closer to the truth, even though everyone watching knows the opposite. The boys also keep making the same planning mistake. They judge each activity by the exciting part advertised at the beginning and ignore the structure surrounding it. Ziplining sounds fast until they are trapped in the safety talk. Horseback riding sounds like freedom until the pace becomes another problem. The boat seems like an escape until they are stuck together again. Each solution preserves the basic condition they hate, which gives the documentary more material to describe as survival. The boys try to escape the tour. That should solve the problem, but each attempted solution creates another organized activity with its own delays. The group moves from ziplining into other outdoor tourism, including horseback riding and eventually a boat trip. Every new option is chosen because it seems faster or more exciting than the last one, and every option turns into another place where they are trapped with instructions, strangers, and waiting. The structure keeps raising the seriousness of the documentary voice, while the actual danger remains mostly boredom. The mismatch becomes the joke. By the time the episode reaches the water, the framing has trained the audience to expect every minor setback to be described like evidence from a catastrophe. Then the show interrupts itself with a warning that the events about to be shown are too disturbing for ordinary dramatization, and the cartoon disappears. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny are now played by real human performers. They are not carefully cast child versions designed to convince anyone that the South Park boys might look like this in real life. They are visibly older. Their bodies do not match the tiny cutout designs. Their costumes and voices do most of the work, while the documentary insists that this is a reenactment of what really happened. The switch works because the episode has spent 15 years teaching the audience what the boys look like. A blue hat and brown coat can signal Stan, even when the person wearing them is physically wrong. Kyle's hat, Cartman's clothing, Kenny's hood, and the familiar voices provide enough information for the characters to survive the replacement. That is a strange form of visual durability. The original construction paper models were built from simple shapes because simple shapes were easy to cut. Those shapes eventually became so recognizable that a live human can wear a rough version of the costume and be understood immediately. The character has become larger than the animated body. The reenactment also reverses the normal relationship between live action and cartoons. A documentary uses live action because viewers assume a filmed body is closer to reality than a drawing. South Park deliberately makes the live action look less trustworthy than the animation. The actors are obviously not the boys. Their movements feel wrong. Their ages are wrong. The setting feels staged. The supposedly more realistic form becomes the least convincing representation in the episode. The narration refuses to admit that. It keeps treating the reenactment with complete seriousness. The performers continue the same situation, and the production leans into the kind of dramatic reconstruction that television documentaries use when the original event was not filmed. South Park is making fun of the authority created by that visual language. A camera does not automatically make a version of events more truthful. The actors also reveal how much the normal animation removes from the characters. A real person has shoulders that move, hands with fingers, a neck, natural walking, and facial muscles. The South Park boys have spent years communicating without most of those things. Seeing human bodies in their costumes does not make the characters richer. It makes them look strangely burdened by physical information they never needed. Cartman is especially useful for that contrast because so much of his design is an impossible shape. The cartoon body is a large round coat with short legs and a simple head. A human performer cannot reproduce those proportions without becoming a costume. The reenactment does not try. It lets the mismatch remain visible, which keeps the documentary parody more important than any attempt at realism. Kenny creates the same problem in a different way. His hood normally reduces him to eyes, color, and a muffled voice. A live performer still has a complete human body underneath the clothing. The character is recognizable, but the very realism of the body makes the familiar disguise feel more artificial. The reenactment continues until Kenny dies. Death is one of the oldest recurring events in South Park, and the live action does not make it solemn. Instead, it gives the familiar joke another layer of fake seriousness. The documentary has been treating boredom as survival, so a death inside the reenactment seems to validate the tone for a moment, even though the entire presentation remains absurd. Then Mr. Hanky appears. A talking piece of feces wearing a small hat has always been possible inside South Park because the entire world is visually artificial. Putting a live-action version into a reenactment creates a new problem. The form that was supposed to bring the event closer to reality now has to accommodate one of the least realistic beings in the series. The production does not solve that contradiction. It uses it. Live-action Mr. Hanky arrives as part of the rescue, and the reenactment continues as though nothing about this has damaged its claim to seriousness. Human bodies, documentary narration, and an impossible Christmas character occupy the same supposed reconstruction. That is the high point of the style change because realism finally loses any special authority. The ordinary animated South Park world never asked the audience to believe the boys were physically real. The reenactment borrows the visual language of reality and then fills it with something that could only come from South Park. Once the episode returns to animation, the boys look normal again. The cutout bodies feel more accurate than the photographed humans because accuracy in a long-running cartoon is based on continuity, not anatomy. Stan's flat face is the face the audience recognizes. Kyle's impossible hat belongs to him more completely than a real fabric hat on an actor does. The cartoon restores the world by becoming less realistic. The aftermath keeps the mock documentary tone alive. Stan turns the experience into a public warning about ziplining, treating a bad vacation choice as something other people need protection from. The boys have survived an activity they voluntarily chose, and the seriousness surrounding the lesson remains out of proportion to what happened. The live-action sequence therefore does more than provide a surprise. It tests how little visual information the characters actually need in order to survive a complete change of medium. Voices, clothing, relationships, and behavior carry them through bodies that have nothing in common with their usual proportions. It also demonstrates the opposite limit. Recognition is not the same as belonging. The audience can identify live-action Cartman immediately, but he does not feel like the permanent Cartman. The human body calls too much attention to itself. The joke depends on wanting the cutout version back. That reaction protects South Park's basic style in a way an ordinary upgrade would not. The live action is technically more realistic, contains natural movement, and uses actual physical bodies. None of those qualities makes it a better default for the series. The familiar animation wins by being the version that has accumulated history. The switch also makes the voices more important than usual. South Park's main boys have been identified by color and silhouette for so long that their voices can survive almost any visual distortion. Hearing the familiar performances come from adult live-action bodies creates a split similar to the Warcraft avatars, but the effect is more unsettling because these are supposed to be the boys themselves rather than characters they control. The sound says continuity, while the bodies say replacement. The costumes bridge that gap just enough. Stan's hat, Kyle's green headwear, Cartman's red and blue clothing, and Kenny's orange hood operate like labels carried from animation into photography. The details are simple because the original character designs were simple. A more realistic cartoon might require prosthetics or complex makeup to recreate a face. South Park only needs the right blocks of color before the audience knows who is supposed to be standing there. The episode also shows how South Park can borrow an outside visual language without surrendering control of the joke. Documentary reenactments come with their own signals: warnings, interviews, dramatic narration, staged footage, and claims to reconstruction. South Park adopts all of them, then pushes them until the form starts exposing its own artificiality. That makes the visual break fundamentally different from Kenny's rotoscoped fantasy. Major Boobage uses real movement underneath drawings to make an altered world feel more seductive. Ziplining removes the drawings and makes the filmed world feel less credible. Both use human performers, but one hides them to gain realism of motion, while the other exposes them to parody realism itself. The actors do not become permanent versions of Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. They are tools used for one fake account of one terrible outing. Once the documentary device has done its work, South Park can return to the bodies that have represented those characters for years. Mr. Hankey supplies the sharpest contradiction in the entire reenactment because he destroys any clean hierarchy between animated and filmed reality. In the cartoon, his existence is accepted because everything around him is already impossible. In live action, his appearance should break the reenactment completely. Instead, the documentary treats him as another fact. The boys finally escape the trip and return to lives where no real actor is required to represent them. The human reenactment becomes one more version of events, and the cheap cutout designs regain their position as the most trustworthy bodies those characters have ever had on screen for many years afterward too. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The live-action detour ends with the cartoon world snapping back into place, making the familiar designs feel permanent again. That certainty becomes harder to defend when older episodes reach newer screens whose shape and resolution were never part of the original broadcast image. Section 8. The HD remaster that rebuilt the past. Old South Park episodes look so simple that an HD upgrade sounds easy. Make the picture sharper, widen the frame, and leave the paper children alone. The trouble is that episodes were built for a different screen shape and resolution, forcing the studio to decide what preserving them actually meant. By the late 2000s, the television format around South Park was changing. High-definition screens were becoming normal. Widescreen presentation was replacing the older square shape, and a show built for years around a 4:3 television frame had to fit a new display environment. New episodes could be produced with those dimensions in mind. More than a decade of older episodes could not. The difference begins with the frame itself. A 4:3 shot has less horizontal space than a 16:9 shot. An animator composing for the older format can place a character near the edge because the edge is part of the design. A background only needs to contain what the camera will see. Widening that image later creates an immediate problem. There may be nothing meaningful beyond the original boundary because nothing beyond the boundary was needed. A simple upscale would avoid that issue by keeping the old composition and enlarging it. The picture would gain pixels, but it would still be the same completed frame. South Park Studios announced something different in January 2009. The team had already spent more than a year going back through earlier episodes and re-rendering shots in native high definition. That word matters. Re-rendering means the studio is returning to production material rather than treating the old television master as an untouchable finished object. Characters, backgrounds, props, and scene information can be processed again at a higher resolution. The final image is newly created from the assets that produced the old one. The approach was possible because South Park had left physical paper behind so early. A photograph paper frame from the original pilot is a completed photograph. A digital scene from the Power Animator or Maya years can contain separate elements behind the finished television image. The same decision that allowed weekly episodes to be revised years earlier now made it possible for the archive itself to be reopened. The timeline needs one distinction because several South Park milestones are easy to collapse into one. The China program, originally aired on October 8, 2008 as Season 12, Episode 8, was produced with widescreen in mind, even though its original television presentation did not suddenly make the whole series an HD broadcast. South Park Studios announced March 11, 2009, the Season 13 premiere as the move into high-definition broadcasting. Production format, broadcast format, and later remastering are related, but they are not the same same event. That distinction changes what the upgrade means. South Park did not wake up one morning with a sharper camera. The production had to start thinking about new episodes in a wider frame, while another effort worked backward through episodes created under older assumptions. One group of images was moving forward, another was being reconstructed from the past. The change also affects editing decisions that were once invisible. A reaction shot designed to feel tight in 4:3 may feel looser if more space appears beside the character. A two-shot can gain empty room that was never part of the original balance. A background character near the edge can become more noticeable simply because the audience is now seeing farther to the side. Widescreen does not have to change the action to change the way attention moves through a composition. That gives the remastering team a responsibility the original broadcast crew did not have. They are handling material whose timing has already been proven. The joke worked in the old frame. The scene already has a history with viewers. Any reconstruction has to respect that history while solving a technical problem the old artists never needed to solve. The safest result is one where the audience barely thinks about the work, which makes the labor behind it easy to underestimate. The digital source also preserves separation between elements that a finished broadcast master flattens together. Once an episode is delivered as a completed television image, the broadcast presents one picture. Inside production, that picture may have been assembled from backgrounds, character pieces, props, effects, and camera information that remain editable. Re-rendering can return to those ingredients. The old master cannot tell a computer what is hidden just beyond the frame, but the production files may contain enough material to reconstruct the shot without simply stretching or cropping the finished image. That is the deeper reason the early software transition matters years after it happened. Reusable digital construction made weekly animation faster and preserved a version of the scene that could be asked new questions later. The same town built to survive rapid rewrites could also survive a change in television standards because the studio retained more than a flat recording of what had aired. Resolution creates its own strange problem for a show that has spent years pretending to be paper. More pixels can expose more detail, but the characters are not supposed to become detailed in a conventional way. Cartman's face does not need pores. Stan's coat does not need realistic fabric fibers. The image can become cleaner without allowing the central designs to lose the blunt simplicity that made them recognizable. That means HD has to improve presentation without turning into a redesign. Edges can become sharper. Textures can be rendered more cleanly. Backgrounds can hold up better on large screens. The image can fill a modern display. The characters still need to look as though they belong to the same visual system as the rough early years. Widescreen composition makes the challenge more obvious because it changes what is visible, not merely how clearly it is visible. A wider frame may need more background on the sides. Crowd layouts may feel different when the audience can see farther. A character positioned for the old frame may sit in a different relationship to the empty space around them. The studio has to preserve the logic of the shot while adapting it to a shape the original episode did not necessarily expect. That work turns restoration into a creative act whether the crew wants it to or not. Every decision about framing, background extension, placement, and rendering determines what a modern viewer sees. The goal may be fidelity, but fidelity is being produced through new technical choices. South Park is especially interesting because the show has joked for years about people tampering with old media. Its own remastering is not the same as rewriting a movie's plot or changing a character's motivation, but the irony remains useful. A series that values a rough, immediate visual identity eventually spends serious resources making old rough images fit newer screens. The archive becomes less like a stack of old tapes and more like a living production library. An episode from years earlier can be opened, processed, and delivered again. The computer files that once made weekly production faster become a kind of time machine, allowing the studio to revisit an earlier stage of the show with tools and output standards that did not exist when the episode first aired. That creates two histories at once. There is the history of what South Park looked like when an episode originally reached television, and there is the history of what that same episode looks like when somebody streams or watches a modern HD version years later. Those experiences can be very close, but they are not automatically identical simply because the dialogue and story have not changed. The difference is easiest to understand with the physical pilot. The all-paper source belongs to a different category because there is no original Maya scene waiting to be re-rendered. The image began as photographed material. Later digital episodes contain production data that can be processed differently. South Park's own technological transition therefore determines how editable different parts of its history are. That is a consequence Parker and Stone could not have needed to plan in 1997. The move to computers was made because weekly production required speed and revision. Years later, those same digital assets allowed the show to survive another technological shift without abandoning its catalog. A decision made to keep episodes moving quickly became useful for preserving them on screens nobody involved in the pilot was designing for. The remastering also complicates nostalgia. A viewer may remember early South Park as fuzzy, square, and visibly limited because that is how it appeared on an older television. A younger viewer can encounter the same season in a clean, widescreen master. Both are watching the same story, but part of the visual experience belongs to different moments in television history and different generations of home television screens entirely today. That matters for a series whose cheap look is part of the appeal. Cleaning an image too aggressively could erase evidence of age that fans associate with the period. Leaving it untouched could make it look broken beside modern material. The studio's answer was to rebuild the presentation while preserving the basic cutout design without flattening the original visual rhythm. The work also reveals how artificial the idea of an original digital image can be. A Maya scene is not a photograph of one permanent reality. It is a collection of instructions, assets, positions, textures, and camera choices that can produce an image. Change the output resolution or framing, and the same underlying scene can generate a different master. The episode that felt finished on broadcast night still contains pieces that can be asked to perform again. That is very different from the original construction paper table, where every photographed frame recorded a physical arrangement that existed for a moment and then had to be moved. The digital archive can preserve the arrangement as data. What began as imitation of handmade animation eventually creates a form of preservation the handmade method never could. The upgrade also changes the meaning of the black bars and cropped edges that used to define television viewing. For years, the edge of the 4:3 frame was an absolute fact for the audience. A character disappeared when the frame ended. A background stopped because the screen stopped. Widescreen turns that old edge into a historical choice rather than a natural boundary. The studio had to decide how to fill the new space without making the old staging feel obviously broken. That is where the remaster becomes more than sharpening. The original composition was created for one rectangle. The modern version lives inside another rectangle. Preserving the scene means adapting relationships between characters, scenery, and empty space rather than simply adding clarity. The process took time because there were years of material to revisit. South Park Studios said the work had already been underway for more than a year by the time the HD transition was publicly announced. That scale matters. The catalog was not being treated as disposable old television. It was important enough to rebuild for the way the program would be watched going forward. The result also keeps the show's central visual joke alive. Modern South Park can be displayed in high resolution with sharp edges and carefully rendered backgrounds, while the characters continue to look like crude pieces of paper. The screen has become more sophisticated. The people on it still pretend they were made with scissors. That tension makes the HD era different from the early digital switch. The first computer transition asked whether South Park could stop using paper without losing the paper look. The HD transition asks whether South Park can stop looking like old television without losing the age and simplicity viewers connect to its early years. The answer is a version of preservation that allows change. The stories remain, the voices remain, the character designs remain recognizable, the frames are rendered again so those same elements can live inside a new technical standard. The archive therefore becomes another place where South Park's style is flexible rather than fixed. The show can alter the method, the resolution, and the shape of the image while preserving the identity strongly enough that the changes may pass unnoticed by someone focused on the joke. There is also a quiet change in ownership once a remaster becomes the version most easily available. The original broadcast image may survive in recordings and memories, but streaming platforms and later releases can make the reconstructed master the everyday South Park for new viewers. Preservation does not merely protect the past. It can decide which version of that past becomes normal. The old 4:3 edge shows how a technical boundary can look permanent until the production files make that boundary negotiable years later for people watching the same episode on newer screens at home today. It once told the production exactly where the South Park world stopped. After widescreen re-rendering, that edge is no longer a permanent wall. It becomes something the studio can reopen, look past, and replace with a wider version of a scene viewers thought had already been finished for many long years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. If the studio could reopen its own old images without losing the characters inside them, the visual identity was more flexible than the paper origin suggested. Soon, images made by people outside the production would enter South Park and begin influencing how two classmates were treated. Section 9, the fan art that changed Tweak and Craig South Park, normally controls exactly how its characters look, even when the style changes completely. Then romantic artwork outside the usual house style starts shaping how two classmates are seen. The animation itself becomes social evidence, and the boys have to live with what those images create. Tweak x Craig arrived on October 28, 2015 as Season 19, Episode 6, with romantic drawings already central to its premise. South Park Studios had publicly asked fans only days earlier to submit original yaoi artwork featuring Tweak Tweek and Craig, allowing images created outside the studio to become part of the visual language surrounding the boys before the finished episode reached television. The submission process makes the timing important. Fans were not sending work to a museum after the episode had been completed. They were sending material while South Park was still making the episode that might contain it. The same production speed that once allowed the show to react to current events was now allowing the audience to feed artwork into a broadcast story within days. That is possible only because the pipeline remains open unusually late. The request also gave fans broad visual freedom. The drawings did not have to imitate the cutout models. In fact, much of the value came from doing the opposite. Romantic fan art could use more delicate faces, dramatic lighting, flowers, fantasy settings, fashionable clothing, or emotional poses that would look absurd if South Park tried to make them part of its normal animation. The outside style was useful because it announced that the image came from somebody's imagination and desire rather than from an ordinary scene in Colorado. When those images appear in school, their physical form matters too. They are pictures people can hold and pass around. A student does not need to have seen Tweek and Craig behave romantically. The drawing provides a visual event ready to be discussed as though it means something. The town's certainty can therefore spread faster than any direct evidence because the evidence has already been illustrated for everyone. More than 1,500 pieces arrived. Some of that fan-created work was incorporated into the episode alongside art produced for the show. That makes the visual break different from anime, Warcraft, rotoscoping, or live action. Those experiments were still designed and controlled as part of the production. Here, people outside the studio were supplying images that would become objects inside South Park itself. The story begins at South Park Elementary, where romantic drawings of Tweek and Craig are spreading among students. The images use a style far removed from the normal cutout designs. Tweek and Craig are taller, softer, more expressive, and placed in intimate poses the ordinary animation has never established between them. Their identities remain recognizable, but the drawings create a relationship before the boys themselves agree that any relationship exists. The school takes the images seriously. Students look at them, discuss them, and begin treating the pictures as information. What started as artwork becomes social evidence. Tweek and Craig are no longer only dealing with what they have said or done. They are dealing with a visual story other people have created about them. That creates a problem neither boy can solve by simply denying the drawings. The pictures keep existing. Other people can hold them, show them, and interpret them. The more the community talks about the supposed relationship, the less control Tweek and Craig have over what their ordinary behavior means. Standing near each other can be read through the drawings. Arguing can be read through the drawings. Denying the relationship can become another part of the story people already think they understand. The fan art therefore changes the normal balance between image and canon. South Park's ordinary animation usually shows the event, and characters respond to what happened. Here the images are not records of an event. They are imagined scenes, yet characters begin responding as if those scenes reveal something true that the boys have not admitted. The town's reaction adds pressure instead of clarity. Adults learn about the supposed relationship and try to respond supportively. The intention may be kind, but the support is built around an assumption neither boy chose to announce. Tweek and Craig become responsible for other people's feelings about a relationship that started as drawings. Their families are pulled into it. The boys are no longer dealing only with classmates making jokes or sharing pictures. Parents begin interpreting what the images mean. The social story moves from school hallways into their homes, where identity, acceptance, embarrassment, and family expectations all attach themselves to the same visual material. Tweek responds with the panic that defines much of his character. He is already a child who struggles when situations feel outside his control. The drawings create a problem with no clear physical source he can remove. There is no single rumor to correct, because the rumor has hundreds of pictures. There is no single person to confront, because the town has accepted the broader idea. Craig reacts differently. He is usually flatter and less visibly anxious, but that does not give him control either. The community has assigned him a role in a relationship, and simply refusing the role does not make the expectations disappear. The two boys have different personalities, yet both are trapped by the same outside narrative. They decide to work with the story rather than keep fighting it. If everyone believes they are together, they can perform the relationship long enough to create a breakup. A public breakup should give the town the ending it seems to want. Once people believe the romance has ended, Tweek and Craig expect to return to ordinary life. That plan turns the images into instructions. The boys begin acting out a version of the relationship that originally existed only in artwork. They are not discovering a hidden memory shown by the drawings. They are changing their behavior because the drawings have changed the environment around them. The staged breakup becomes more difficult than expected because performance still affects real people. Tweek and Craig have to decide who will appear responsible. Craig takes the role that will make the breakup convincing, and the emotional consequences do not stay contained inside the plan. What is supposed to be fake begins producing real hurt. The community responds to the breakup as if it has lost something. That reaction matters because it shows how far ownership has moved away from the boys. People who were not part of the supposed relationship feel invested in its survival. The images gave them a version of Tweek and Craig they liked, and the boys are now expected to protect that version. Craig's home becomes one of the places where the pressure changes shape. His father has to confront what he thinks his son's relationship means and what his response should be. The subject is no longer an abstract school trend. It is attached to somebody he loves. The episode gives that family response enough weight that the fan art stops being a simple joke about online culture. The boys eventually reconnect. The reconciliation leaves them in a different position from the beginning. At the start, Tweek and Craig are two classmates reacting to a romance other people drew for them. By the end, their relationship has been altered by the experience of pretending, breaking up, hurting each other, and dealing with the reactions around them. The episode does not need the fan art to prove anything about what either boy was before the drawings appeared. That would turn outside images into a diagnosis the story does not support. The stronger point is chronological. The artwork changes how the town treats them. That treatment changes what they do. Their choices then create consequences the original drawings could not guarantee. That keeps the difference between canon and interpretation clear. The drawings are canon objects. The community's pressure is canon. The staged relationship and breakup are canon. The reconciliation is canon. The claim that strangers' art created an orientation would be an unsupported conclusion. The episode is about social expectations becoming strong enough to influence behavior, not artwork possessing magical knowledge about two children. The production history makes that theme even sharper. Some of the images really did come from fans. People outside South Park imagined versions of Tweek and Craig, sent those versions to the studio, and then watched the finished cartoon treat similar images as a force acting on the characters. The audience's creative work crossed the boundary into canon as a physical object before the characters had any control over it. That is almost the opposite of Make Love Not Warcraft. Blizzard supplied a visual world that remained separate from the boys' real bodies. The fan art enters the boys' own school, bedrooms, homes, and relationships. It does not create a second world they can log out of. It changes how the existing world looks at them. The style matters because normal South Park animation would weaken that pressure. If the romantic scenes were shown only through standard character models, they might look like events that actually happened. The exaggerated yaoi drawings signal imagination, projection, and idealization. They show Tweek and Craig as other people want to see them, not as the episode has established them behaving on their own. The contrast is especially strong with Craig. His ordinary design and performance are controlled, blunt, and emotionally restrained. Fan art can give him soft expressions, dramatic poses, and a romantic intensity that the normal character rarely displays. The picture is recognizable as Craig, while also being somebody else's interpretation of Craig. Tweek undergoes the same transformation from the opposite direction. His ordinary body is tense, shaking, and overwhelmed. The drawings can present him as graceful and idealized. The artistic style removes the traits that make everyday Tweek difficult to romanticize cleanly, then sells the polished version back to the people who know him. That gap becomes part of the pressure. The town is responding partly to idealized images rather than to the messy boys standing in front of them. Tweek and Craig cannot compete with versions of themselves that never panic at the wrong moment, never become awkward, and exist only inside finished romantic compositions. Later canon gives the episode its most important fallout. Tweek and Craig continue as a couple, rather than returning permanently to the earlier status quo. In Put It Down, originally aired on September 20th, 2017, as Season 21, Episode 2, their relationship is treated as an ordinary fact of their lives. The conflict is no longer whether other people think they belong together. Craig is trying to help Tweek manage fear, and eventually has to understand what kind of support Tweek actually needs. That later story matters because the couple now exists without needing the fan drawings to explain every interaction. Tweek worries. Craig responds badly at first by trying to solve the problem. They argue, adjust, and reconnect. Their relationship has moved from an image other people imposed on them into something capable of carrying its own character conflict. The change does not retroactively make the original fan art factual evidence. A drawing of an imagined romantic scene does not become a record of something that happened because the boys later date. The images remain projections. Their power came from how people reacted to them, not from secretly documenting the future. That distinction is what makes the episode more interesting than a simple fan service story. The audience contributed a style the show normally does not use. The fictional town overread that style. The two characters then had to live inside the social consequences created by the overreading. Art influenced reality without becoming reality itself. South Park had spent years borrowing visual forms from other media, but this time the borrowed material arrived from the same culture that watches, draws, discusses, and interprets the show. The boundary between producer and audience became temporarily porous. Fans did not write the episode episode, but some of their images became part of the environment that drove it. The later relationship also gives the artwork a second life inside the audience. A fan who submitted an idealized picture before broadcast could later see the series treat Tweek and Craig as an established couple. That does not turn the submission into prophecy, but it creates an unusual feedback loop where fandom imagines a relationship. The show uses fandom's images as story material, and canon eventually continues the relationship beyond the episode that began with those images. The romantic drawing changes meaning depending on when it is viewed. At the beginning, it depicts something Tweek and Craig reject as an outside fantasy. After everything that follows, the same kind of image exists in a world where the two boys continue having a relationship. The picture did not prove the relationship. It helped create the pressure under which their relationship changed. That makes fan art one of South Park's strangest animation changes. The alternate style does not show a dream, a game, a drug trip, or a reenactment. It shows somebody else's idea of the characters, and the characters have to respond because their town starts treating that idea as evidence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A drawing still looks like somebody's interpretation, even when a town treats it as evidence. Moving images create a more difficult problem once invented scenes can borrow the texture, motion, and apparent authority of ordinary footage without announcing that anyone built them. Section 10. The deepfake era that broke the cartoon boundary. South Park spent decades making obviously artificial images communicate reality clearly. Its newest visual problem works in the opposite direction. Synthetic media can imitate photographic evidence well enough that characters stop agreeing on what happened, while the production itself mixes live performers, digital face work, and deliberately crude practical effects. Sermon on the Mount arrived on July 23, 2025 as Season 27, Episode 1, and made the shift impossible to miss. South Park had caricatured presidents, celebrities, and public figures for decades through the same cutout logic used for everyone else. Donald Trump had already been represented through the show's animated world. Then the episode moved into a live-action sequence that looked as though a real human performance had been pulled into a nightmare version of political advertising. The body was no longer a paper cutout. The texture of skin, movement of clothing, lighting, and physical space came from photographed material. The face carried a synthetic likeness created through deepfake technology. The result sat far outside the normal South Park look, yet the purpose was still recognizable. The show wanted an image that felt uncomfortably close to real footage while remaining ridiculous enough to belong to South Park. That combination matters because deepfake work is different from the earlier style changes. Anime announces fantasy immediately. World of Warcraft announces a game. Rotoscoping announces an altered visual world. The live-action reenactment in ziplining announces that somebody is staging a reconstruction. A convincing synthetic likeness can arrive with the visual authority of a camera recording something that appears to have happened. The production method was also more mixed than the finished shot suggested. Parker and Stone later explained that a real actor performed the Trump material. Deepfake technology supplied the presidential face. Visual effects connected the elements. One of the most talked about crude physical details used a tiny practical prop associated with a human finger rather than being created entirely by an artificial intelligence system. That behind-the-scenes detail fits South Park almost too well. The show had reached a point where proprietary deepfake tools could alter filmed human performance, yet one of the most ridiculous parts of the shot still depended on an intentionally cheap physical gag. The technology had become vastly more advanced than construction paper, but the instinct to combine sophisticated systems with something that looks stupid by hand had not changed. Parker and Stone had also been developing deepfake technology through Deep Voodoo before this sequence reached South Park. The company grew from work that began around 2020 and explored face replacement and synthetic performance. That meant the visual experiment was connected directly to the creator's own production interests rather than being a service added for one political joke. The important boundary is that deepfake work, conventional visual effects, practical effects, live-action photography, and generative video are not the same thing. South Park's modern visual language can combine them, but treating every unusual image as one vague form of AI would erase the production choices that make the joke work. The Trump footage is especially useful because a real performance remains underneath the synthetic face. That hybrid approach continues South Park's oldest pattern. The original digital series hid a three-dimensional rig under a flat paper texture. Major boobage hid live human movement under drawings. The Trump sequence hides a human performer under a digitally altered likeness. The image changes radically, but the production keeps building one layer on top of another instead of relying on a single method. Season 28 pushes the subject further because synthetic media stops being only a technique used by the show and becomes part of the story the characters are living through. Originally aired on November 12, 2025 as Season 28, Episode 3, Sora Not Sorry centers on fake videos spreading through South Park Elementary story after Butters uses AI as part of a revenge plan. The first danger is familiar enough. A convincing fake image can make someone appear to have done something they did not do. Children can create humiliating or damaging footage without needing the event to happen. The social power of the Tweak and Craig drawings has returned in a more aggressive form. People can still react to an image that was invented, but the image now has motion, sound, and the visual language of recorded evidence. That changes the speed of belief. A drawing asks people to interpret a fantasy. A realistic video can appear to document behavior directly. The person targeted by it has to prove that an event visible on a screen never occurred. South Park has spent years using its own crude visual style to make impossible events readable. Sora Not Sorry uses a more convincing visual technology to make false events harder for characters to reject. Detective Harris becomes part of the problem because law enforcement depends on evidence. When fabricated footage spreads, the question is no longer only whether a video looks disturbing. The question is whether anyone can trust the image enough to act on it. The system built to investigate events starts losing confidence in one of the forms of evidence modern people are used to treating as direct. The school setting also makes the first consequences personal instead of abstract. A fake clip does not need to influence an election or move a financial market to hurt someone. It can embarrass a classmate, create a rumor, or give adults a reason to punish a child for something that only exists on a screen. The scale is small enough for South Park to show the damage clearly before the same logic reaches public figures and institutions. The old rule that seeing is believing becomes unstable. Characters are used to arguing over what people said, what they meant, or who is lying. Synthetic media lets the argument begin one step earlier. They can now disagree over whether the event itself ever happened. A video no longer ends the dispute by showing the moment. It can become the disputed object. That changes the role of the audience too. South Park has spent decades training viewers to read sudden style shifts as clues. A different look usually tells the audience which mental or media space they have entered. Synthetic footage weakens that signal because its goal can be to imitate the appearance of ordinary evidence rather than announce a new world. The more convincing the image becomes, the less useful visual polish is as a guide to truth. The episode escalates beyond school revenge because the existence of fake footage creates a second weapon. If a false video can be presented as real, a real or damaging image can also be dismissed as artificial. Once everybody knows convincing synthetic media exists, denial becomes easier. A person does not need to prove that the footage is fake immediately. They can create doubt by pointing to the technology. That is the strongest change in South Park's relationship with animation because the style itself becomes part of the conflict. Earlier visual experiments told the audience which reality they were seeing. Anime meant imagination. Warcraft meant the game. Rotoscoping meant Kenny's altered experience. Live action meant a fake documentary reconstruction. In the synthetic media story, the characters are no longer sure what category an image belongs to. The problem works in both directions. A fabricated image can gain the authority of reality. Reality can lose authority because fabrication is possible. The visual technology does not merely create another world, it damages the boundary used to tell worlds apart. That makes Sora Not Sorry an especially fitting South Park story. The series has always depended on the audience accepting something obviously fake. Stan is a flat digital cutout pretending to be construction paper. Nobody watches him and wonders whether the image is a photographic record. The artificiality is open. Synthetic video creates the opposite condition. Its usefulness comes from hiding the artificiality well enough that people may treat it as a record. The shift also changes who needs animation skill. In the early years, creating a new South Park image required people inside the production pipeline. Fan art opened a small door by allowing outsiders to supply finished pictures. Synthetic tools make it possible for ordinary characters inside the story to produce persuasive moving images with far less traditional production work. The ability to manufacture a visual claim spreads beyond studios and trained artists. That democratization is what makes the episode's school setting useful. The danger does not require a government laboratory or a Hollywood effects house. Children can create media capable of changing reputations and confusing adults. The technology is frightening because the power to make convincing images has become ordinary enough to use for petty revenge. The creator's public comments in 2026 keep the production side from turning into a simple anti-technology message. Parker and Stone have described new tools as part of the same creative experimentation that has always shaped South Park. They compared the excitement around current technology with earlier changes in digital production, including tools that once seemed revolutionary simply because artists could draw or animate differently. That position matches the history of the show better than a blanket rejection would. South Park exists because Parker and Stone repeatedly adopted technology that let them work faster or break visual rules. Power Animator replaced paper. Maya replaced Power Animator. Game Capture supplied another world. Rotoscoping supplied human motion. Digital reconstruction rebuilt old episodes. Deepfake work is another tool entering the same long chain. The satire is aimed aimed at what happens when the tool changes social behavior, not at the idea that artists should refuse to touch it. Sora Not Sorry can mock fake media, while South Park's own production uses synthetic visual techniques. There is no contradiction if the subject is misuse, confusion, and the collapse of trust, rather than the mere existence of software. The modern production cycle still matters here. In 2026, Parker and Stone described South Park's current schedule as longer than the famous 6-day version, closer to roughly 10 days for contemporary episodes. That is still extraordinarily fast for animation, and the basic priority remains recognizable. Tools are valuable when they help artists reach the idea without trapping the production under unnecessary delay. The current visual experiments therefore do not erase the old paper rule. Most of South Park still looks like South Park. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, Kenny, Butters, Randy, and the town do not become photorealistic because the studio now has access to technology capable of synthetic human likenesses. The ordinary cutout style remains the base precisely because radical departures have more impact when they are temporary. The Trump sequence works because a live human body suddenly appears where a paper caricature belongs. Sora Not Sorry works because fake videos possess a visual credibility the normal cartoon does not seek. The new technologies are not replacing the house style. They are being used to create images the house style cannot communicate as efficiently. That returns the series to the same problem it had in 1997 from the opposite direction. The first digital artists had to stop computers from looking too advanced. They scanned paper, preserved rough textures, limited movement, and flattened three-dimensional scenes because a polished computer image would have damaged the identity of South Park. Nearly 3 decades later, the production can create images sophisticated enough to make a photographed human performance carry somebody else's face. The challenge is no longer whether a computer can imitate paper. The challenge is deciding when the power to imitate reality is useful, when it becomes the joke, and when the audience needs to see the machinery behind the illusion. That last part is where the tiny practical prop becomes more important than it first appears. Parker and Stone could demonstrate a crude physical object involved in a sequence discussed as deepfake television. The object looks closer in spirit to something from the old craft table than to a futuristic synthetic media lab. A human hand still enters the process. South Park never followed a straight path from primitive animation to advanced animation. Each new tool gave the show another way to preserve the paper illusion or abandon it when the joke needed something else. Synthetic media pushes that freedom furthest because the visual style can now become part of the argument over what is real. The common rule is not that South Park must always look cheap. The common rule is that the visual method has to serve the joke. The show protects its crude cutout identity when that identity is useful and abandons it the moment another form can reveal something the paper bodies cannot. A human hand creates a direct link back to the earliest production method. The first South Park characters moved because human fingers pushed paper pieces across a surface between photographs. Decades later, after Maya, HD, rotoscoping, game capture, live action, fan submissions, and deepfake technology, a modern visual gag still finds room for a ridiculous physical object attached to a human finger. Across all 10 sections, South Park's animation changes for the same basic reason. The show protects its crude paper identity until the joke demands something that identity cannot do. The tools become faster, cleaner, and more advanced, while the series keeps returning to the same deliberately simple faces. By the time live action, fan art, game footage, rotoscoping, and synthetic imagery enter the frame, that contrast becomes part of the joke itself. Across this video essay, every visual change shows how far South Park can stretch its look without losing what made it recognizable in the first place. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.